understand what the character of Jesus, the speaker, the author here, as to what he's doing, and particularly in these two, it seems to me that what we're really talking about is humility. The humility that we are supposed to have as servants. So I thought, why not look at the humility of Christ to get an idea of him as the speaker? So let's go to a really familiar verse, Isaiah chapter 53. And I suspect if you have taken the Lord's Supper more than once in your life, you have heard this chapter referred to, and very appropriately so. So let's go over to chapter 53 of Isaiah. And this is Isaiah's speaking prophetically, but let's go down to, well, actually, let's get the whole context. It'll be Isaiah 53, 1 through 7. And the point of looking at this is to say, is Jesus qualified to give this parable about humility? Because as we're looking at this, he's going to make some pretty strong statements about how we are to think about humility and our relationship with others. But is he qualified to do this? So let's read chapter 53, verses 1 through 7. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Everybody heard this passage before? Okay. What are the points we normally make from this passage? Or what do you get from this passage as it relates to Jesus' character? Okay. Okay, so the first word you mentioned there, Antonella, was he was humble. All right, what others see, Ann?
That everything that he went through, he didn't do it for himself. He did it for others. He did it for us.
Okay, did not do it for himself, did it for others. Roger?
He also did it willingly.
Okay, did it willingly. All right, yeah, you get the idea here is, open not his mouth when he was being led to slaughter or being led to being sheared. Okay? Any other observations about this? Yeah, he served in that role as being a shepherd. All right, so keep this in mind. This is prophetic as Isaiah is giving it to us. Now go over to Philippians chapter 2. This is Paul going to be speaking in, I think, even more a little bit directly as it relates to what we're going to talk about, the parable of the feast and the banquet. So in Philippians chapter 2, and we'll look at verses 1 through 10, just listen to how Paul is describing here Jesus. And actually what Paul is doing, he's encouraging the Philippians by using the example of Jesus. So he says in chapter 2, "So, if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and any sympathy, complete my joy of being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each one of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. So you see here, he's giving the people to whom he's writing direct commandments or observations about humility and about not counting others greater than yourselves, putting the interest of others. And now he's going to shift in verse 5 to the example of Christ. Have this mind among yourselves, which is in yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Why would Paul here, when if you go back to verse 4, which seems to be a little bit summing up the direction he had just given the people, let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Why would he then use the example of Christ to emphasize that point? Okay, and I think, Ernest, that's a really good point, is he's using the contrast. If Christ is willing to do this, you ought to be willing to do this. All right? Other observations, why in making this point does Paul use this example of Christ? And think about what particularly was he saying about Christ here. What did Christ do? Okay, he became a servant. Verse 7 there, as Roger alludes to, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. All right, which, when you think of servitude or servant, the idea of humility starts creeping into that. Bert?
In both Isaiah and here, Christ is doing what God has set him up to do. It's what he has sent him
Mm-hmm.
to do. It said in Isaiah that he did this under God, or the watchful eye of God, something like that. And in here, he's talking about that God that's all Christ is doing. He's not trying to do this to build himself up or anything. He's just serving his master.
Okay, so you see again the idea of servitude coming through. And
In verse 6, who existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's really hard for a human to understand that here you have an entity of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, who's now in the form of a human, and he's saying, I am not trying to be equal with God.
okay, and I'm glad you picked this verse 6 up. As we get into these parables here, I think one of the things that you're going to see as the person who was the guest, particularly, as he goes in to sit, from all I can tell by his social standing or whatever, he was equal to the party, so to speak. He wasn't someone who crashed the party. He was invited. He had every right to go get the seat of honor. In the same sense here, you have Christ here, even well above the person in the parable. He was equal with God. And yet, to Ann's point, what was he willing to do with that equality?
He just made himself nothing. And Kevin, he didn't, you can tell from his human standpoint, he didn't want to do it. He asked
Right.
God to take that cup from him.
Right?
But he knew what he was going to accomplish for us. And that was more important to him than how he felt about going through this horrible
Right.
thing he was going
And he was willing to give it up.
Yeah.
Does someone's translation have something in verse 6 different than did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped? Ernest?
Mine tries to robbery, that who made him form God?
Did not consider it robbery? Okay, I hadn't heard that translation before.
Mine is something to be used to his own advantage.
So, what was that, Sandy?
Something to be used for his own advantage.
Okay, and Joe?
The King James is very, very close to that, saying, in essence, is what I understand, I may be wrong, that he knew he was equal with God, but then, of course, he didn't try to make any reputation of it. But in this reading, it sounds very much like he was very aware that he was equal with God the Father.
Oh, yeah, and I think that's, I don't have any doubt that he was fully aware of that, but this idea of did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, the way I interpret it is something that he was going to hold on to, and a little bit like what your translation says, Sandy, to his advantage. Because, you know, he could have, think about it, when he was being seized in the garden. Remember how he says, don't you know I could have called down XYZ to stop this, but I'm not going to take advantage of that. Ann?
The easy English puts it, but Christ did not demand that he should continue to be important like God.
Okay.
That's,
Yeah, and it's that demand to be important. We're going to see kind of themes of that when we get to the parable here. So now, having read the passage in Isaiah and the passage here in Philippians, what are you seeing about Christ's attitude toward humility? Okay. Antonella, then Denny?
What I wanted to mention is, it reminds me what Jesus did when he washed the disciples' feet.
Okay.
And Peter said, Lord, you shall not wash my feet. And the Lord said, if I don't do this, you have no part with me. Because that's what he, after he did it, he said to them, this is how I want you to treat one another.
Yeah, and that's a really good thought. In fact, we're going to everybody go to John 13. Antonella's got us there, which is good. Then Denny, do you have a comment?
I think it's teaching too that the only way toward God to lift you up and honor you is for you to humble yourself. You can't humble yourself. The Father cannot honor you. Can't lift you up. Nobody has a better right to teach that than Jesus, because he wasn't just giving up a position at a dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
He gave up heaven.
Yeah, that's a really good.
The greatest thing that anyone could ever give up. And only a self-centered Pharisee can miss that point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This idea of you can't be honored until you are willing to be humbled, which I think is what we're going to see in the parables. Okay, one last verse, or Antonella alluded to it. Let's go to John chapter 13, and just real quickly we'll look at 14 through 15. You know the whole event, which begins in verse 1, when he's going to go through the process of washing the apostles' feet. And as Antonella alluded to, Peter says in verse 8, "Ye shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash your feet, you have no share with me." Then Peter says, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean." Now go down to verse 12. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you?" It's almost alluding back, Peter, you missed the point here, so I'm going to tell you what it is. In verse 13, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you were right, for so I am." Now the point, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you." Particularly in verse 14 when he says, "You also ought to wash one another's feet." I think we're going to see ideas of this now as we find our way back to Luke 14 in terms of who's going to sit where. And it seems so simple. So let's go to Luke chapter 14. We'll get into the parables that is the subject of today's lesson. But he's going to use this extremely simple idea in image of who gets to sit where. You know, something that's seemingly very simple, but if you think about it even today, what do we say about where people sit at dinner tables? They're what? Okay. In what way, Joy?
Well, usually the oldest of the family sits at the head of the table.
Okay, yeah, even in the most informal settings, we have heads of the table. If you go to any social function, you can pretty much figure out who paid what to go to that function. Whether you're, the more you pay, the closer you'll typically sit, or if there are VIPs or guests of honor, they typically have certain seats as compared to others. It's something that James had to address in the context of church services, and talks about if someone comes into your assembly, that's dressed in fine clothes, what do we typically say? Yeah, come. Well, we probably say, oh, you can have the very best seat in the back now, because we won't have you come to the front. But the idea here is you're going to get this place of honor here. So he's going to use these this very familiar situation to really drive home this point of humility. So I've been talking a lot. Roger, would you read chapter 14, verses 7 through 11 for us? This is the parable of the wedding feast.
14, 7 through 11.
Yep.
So he told a parable to those who were invited. When he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man. And then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes in, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.
Great, thank you. All right, so this one is dealing with the guest side. Everybody see that? Verse 7, told a parable to those who were invited. So the image that we're using here is, you're the guest. Now, notice what the guests do here. Jesus said, I told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them. What do we know about the guest at this point?
Maybe some more honorable than others.
Okay, I think it's going to prove to be that, maybe.
They think very highly of themselves.
In what way, Justin?
Well, they took the highest places of honor at the feast, and they didn't even realize what their relationship was with who had invited them.
Yeah, notice that in verse 7, the only thing we know about these people is that they were invited. There were no wedding crashers here. So, but we don't know about, I got an A-list invitation or I was on the secondary list. Everybody was invited, and what did they do? It says,
They went to the places of honor.
yeah, exactly. Because notice, I just think it's interesting how it says of Jesus, when he noticed how they chose the places of honor. All right, so let's take it down today. You're walking into a wedding, a party, a banquet, a political event, whatever. You're going into a crowd. You're going into a movie theater. What do we all do? And it's open seating, by the way. What do we do?
We search for the best seat.
Yeah. I mean, it's, now, the definition of best seat can be a lot of things. I've been to a lot of events where the best seat is where you have the quickest way out. That happens a lot. But no one, trust me, as one who flies a lot, no one says, boy, am I looking for that center seat here. That's the one I want. And You know, if you fly Southwest, which Kathy and I do a lot because we go to Nashville a lot, you know, it's open seating. You want to check in early so you can get an aisle seat. No one's saying, boy, I hope I get that center seat so that everybody else will have the aisle seat or the window seat, right? So is there anything unusual about this group of people that Jesus sees here? No, exactly. And that's what, when I read this, I thought, okay, he's going to give them this parable here, but I don't think they're acting any differently then than we might act now. But he's going to go into this discussion of how one ought to think about themselves. Okay, so in verse 8, you know, Jesus he has noticed that they're invited guests. He noticed how they have chosen the place of honor. He says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, okay, they're normal guests, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. What is Jesus recognizing by that statement?
That there is people who you want to give more honor to.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Richard?
Yeah, don't put the host in an awkward position of having to come tell you to move.
Yeah, and that is exactly the direction he's going to go. And we've probably all been in events when that has happened. I'll tell you a quick story. And this is me being really bad. So I was invited to this very nice event. Well, you remember Sheriff Glover, Nat Glover? Wonderful human being. So they were going to have a big last farewell to him. And so we get there, and it was, you know, we had really good seats, let's say it that way. And I was with John Delaney and a bunch of other people, and we're looking at the program. I'm going, this thing's going to take forever because it had all of these really high quality speakers. So table of 10, we're all sitting there, and then this group of people, another group of 10 came up and said, you're in our seats. I mean, we were literally on the front row going, oh, well, this is awkward. And so everybody looked at their tickets. They had just double printed the tickets. So being very bad, what do you think 9 of us did?
I've got this seat.
Huh? What?
This is my ticket.
Oh, no. That's what we should have said. There was 9 of us who said, having looked at the program, realizing how long it was going to be, said, oh, we're so sorry. You take our seats. But we said to John Delaney, I'm sorry, John, you're speaking. You have to stay. So we gave up our seats, and we promptly went and had a very nice dinner ourselves. I would love to tell you we had really pure motives in giving up our seats. We did not. We were just going, we're going to get out of here earlier. Credit for the invite for being there. And so actually, we went and had dinner in the hotel, walked by about 2 hours later. That program was still going. So we were very happy. But anyway, so in this situation, as Ann said, there were some people, there were distinctions here. And is Jesus really criticizing that? Ernest? Yeah.
The statement or the question you were asking earlier, kind of compared to many we're actually looking at. When I bounce back and I take a look back in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, the thing that I actually noticed, in verse 5, the promise is Satan made, let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. So the point was made to not, when the comment was made, don't force the host to be in a position to have to do something like that. But the real point is having the mind frame to say, instead of putting myself in a position and saying, hey, I'm going to take this, you know what, we want to take this back area right here. Because I know that's a bigger focus point. It's not having someone tell you something or that you can put somebody in that position. Don't put yourself in that position. Yes, you may feel like I deserve this, I need to have this, or I haven't had the spotlight a long time, I'm going to take that. Instead,
Yeah. Well, and you raise a good point. Richard's kind of alluded to it too. By not choosing the place of honor, 2 people are spared. One, the host, of having to come up in the very awkward situation saying, you know, you're really not supposed to be here. Let me sit you somewhere else. And you're not putting that person who is also trying to have that seat in the awkward position of am I going to go there? Because he says in verse 9, well, going back to verse 8, when you are invited by someone to the wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, the host, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. Now, by not doing that, you also spare yourself some embarrassment, too. You know, this idea of, one thing that happens, the guy who chose the good seat is going to get displaced here. And so that's an awkward, embarrassing situation for him. So Jesus said, here's the way to avoid this situation. Verse 10, when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. Why will you be honored by being moved from the back of the plane to the front of the plane, so to speak?
Because you humbled yourself in the first place, and now people are watching you
Yeah.
more distinctly.
Yeah, it's almost as, well, who is that? That the host, just think about it. The host affirmatively went out and found this person and moved you up. And everyone's going, wonder who that is, if they didn't already know. Now, before we get to verse 11, is the point of the parable here where you ought to sit when you go to a function? What's the point Jesus is driving here?
Don't presume you're important.
Don't what?
Don't presume you are important.
Okay, don't presume your importance. Is that limited to going to a function like this?
No.
Okay. Why did he use this situation, this event, to create the parable?
They are at the leader of the Pharisees' house. That's what verse 1 says.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are there are leaders in the community because they want to scrutinize what Jesus is going to say.
Yeah. Ann brings up a good point. Go back to verse 1. We talked a lot about this last week. Just you have to put yourself in this situation. And we see this a lot in the New Testament, that dining at someone's house is really where we have events of importance identified and kind of the social strata identified. You remember when Zacchaeus invited Jesus to eat at his house? What did everybody say?
Why would you go there?
Yeah, why would you go there? Because he's a tax collector, he's a sinner. And I think it's very purposeful. Jesus not only accepted the invitation, but I think there's some argument that he maybe even initiated the invitation, because he wanted to show how much he was willing to go into that setting, into someone's house. Okay?
And I also think it's more of Jesus, just the way he knows his strategy. Because everybody generally eats.
Right.
And
Mhm.
has, probably has dinners with people. So I think everybody can understand what he's saying. It's not, some very hard to understand philosophy.
Yeah, and we still attach importance today to dining with one another. Here comes pure trivia that I read about yesterday. Yesterday was the 100th anniversary of the first African American to be invited to get as a guest in the White House to dine. It was Booker T. Washington and Theodore Roosevelt. And at the time, that was considered scandalous that the president would do that. But he was making a very purposeful point of, I'm going to invite Mr. Washington to dine here. And it created a lot of controversy, good and bad, toward that, because it was the idea of you're dining. Now go to chapter 14 and verse 1. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of the rulers of the Pharisees, and then just a few minutes later, I don't know exactly how long, but sometime later, he's going to give them this parable. Do you think they're all looking around the table like, am I in the right seat all of a sudden? Yeah, because I don't know where they placed Jesus in that, but they were in the house of a prominent person for whom I'm guessing where you sat was probably really important at that time. All right? So what do you think's the point that he's really making here about humility? And I think, Ann, I like the word you use, Ann, don't presume your own importance. Bert?
Well, I have two thoughts about it.
Okay.
One is, I taught teenagers for many years, and one of the things I tried to teach them some leadership lessons, and one of the lessons I always tried to get across was successful people always believe they're getting what they deserve. It's not like, no, you all owe me more respect. You owe me a better place. You owe me this. Successful people know where they are, and they're getting what they get. If they want more, work harder. The other thought I've always had is, don't try to hurry God's plan. God has a plan for you, and God works on Bible time, not our time.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's, let his plan for us play out the way it's supposed to play out. Don't try to push it. And so I think this is kind of the idea, just, be humble, do what God has sent you on earth to do, and let things happen the way God planned for it.
Yeah, and then in this analogy or this parable, it's as sit where you're kind of supposed to be.
Yeah.
Now, let's look at verse 11. He's going to sum up, or he's going to deliver the point of the parable. You see the indication there when he says, for everyone who exalts himself. So having delivered this situation, which, one of the things that's neat about the parable, I think it has relevance today because we can probably all think about situations having occurred like this. He says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Think about that exactly in the context of what happened. The guy who went and got the place of honor, the host had to come and say, you need to move. Do you think that was humbling or humiliating to him? Yeah. And then the guy who the host came and said, you need to move to a better seat, he was exalted. Or it's not a word we use a lot, but everybody see what he's talking about? The one who tried to take advantage of the situation, he's humbled. The one who did not ultimately was exalted. Does someone's translation have something other than exalted? It's not a word that I've used in a lot of casual conversation, but anybody else? Pam, what does your translation have?
Mine has honored.
Honored? Okay. That's probably something we can think about. That's a word that we use a little bit more. All right, so keeping this in mind, what do you say? What do you learn about humility from this? Okay, necessary in what way, Dee Dee?
To do what the Lord has expected us to do. You've got to be humble. You've got to be a servant.
Okay. And think about, going back to Philippians, Paul uses the phrase, have this mind in you, also like Christ. I think one of the things he's saying here about this is, this needs to be your mindset of humility, such that when you walk into it, you're not having to go, oh, I'm not supposed to take that seat, I'm supposed to go there. You're already predisposed that way. Look over in Matthew chapter 23, very similar situation, where this is Jesus again speaking. So in Matthew chapter 23, verse 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. If we go back into the beginning of chapter 23, he uses this idea of where people are going to sit, but he's doing it more in the context here of being critical of the scribes and the Pharisees. Look in we'll read it quick, chapter 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they also are not willing to move one finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. Verse 6, and they love the place of honor at feast and the best seats in the synagogue. So obviously this is something that Jesus had been observing in their behavior. And in particular now, him having said this in Matthew chapter 23, go back to Luke 14:1, this scene of them dining at the house. Again, I think they were probably competing, where they were going to sit at that time. And he's already given them this situation to where that's what they liked. They liked the showiness of it, and they liked to get the best seats. Okay, everybody see what we're talking about here with being how we're supposed to be the guests? Now we'll go to chapter 14, and we'll look at the second parable. Different event, but now we're going to be directing it toward the host. So this is Luke chapter 14, and just a couple of verses. He also said to the man who had invited him. So who's Jesus speaking to?
The leader of the Pharisees.
Yeah, go back to 14:1. He is dining at the house of the ruler of the Pharisees, so that's who Jesus is speaking to. So he's going to say to him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Think about, he is talking to the guy who's the ruler of the Pharisees, who's invited Jesus. Who else do you think's at that dinner?
Warren, the other important Pharisees and leaders.
Yeah. We don't know for sure, Joy, but I think that's a real safe assumption because of the two parables that Jesus is going to give. So how do you think this guy now feels when Jesus says, you don't invite your relatives, don't invite the rich neighbors, but you should invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind? Okay.
Probably pretty angry.
I think the guy's either got to feel about 2 feet tall, or maybe he's angry, because Jesus is directly saying to you, don't invite the people that you have around the table. Again, my assumption. But here's the people that you ought to invite. Now, is it wrong to invite the rich and your brothers and your relatives and rich neighbors? Is it wrong to do that?
Probably depends what your rationale is.
Okay, in what way, Sandy?
If you're doing it to get to the A list, if you will.
Right.
To expect a similar type of invitation with a similar class of people, then that's what Jesus said you don't want to be doing.
Yeah. I hope it's not wrong to invite our relatives, because Thanksgiving is going to be really challenging if we don't do that. But I think you're exactly right, Sandy. If your motive for doing that, for inviting them, is so that they can later repay you, that becomes the problem. Again, more trivia. I read an article this morning. Everybody heard about God, naming a godfather for your child or a godparent for your child. I didn't realize this. Apparently, in the Catholic Church, but particularly in Sicily, it has become such a problem that people were doing it for social climbing. If I can convince the, godparent. Catholic Church has now banned that in Sicily. It used to be a very big part of the ceremony of baptism of infants was we're going to identify the godfather. And it had gotten to the point where you were basically buying your godparents. To where you would say, hey, would you be, I'll pay you X to be the godparent of my child, because then I can run around and say so-and-so is the godparent of my child. And the Catholic Church banned that. Just trivia for your knowledge there. Okay, Roger? But think about it. It's kind of the same idea of I'm doing it because I'm trying to get some social honor out of it. Roger?
I'm a little perplexed here because this is a wedding feast. Wouldn't you invite your relatives and friends of the family and what have you? And I can still see inviting the maimed, the lame, and the blind.
Well, look at verse 8 and then verse 12. I think we've moved outside of the wedding feast. Okay, so in verse 8, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, and then in verse 12 he says, when you, host, give a dinner or a banquet. I think it's a different situation. But I think it really all does go down to what is your motive for doing that? Let's take Roger, let's assume that it is the same wedding feast. And I have gotten a venue that says, 150 people can be seated. And so let's say I'm going down my list and I'm running out of seats. And I say, Kathy and I have gone through this in the last couple of years, and I say, I could invite Virginia's best friend from high school and her parents, or I can invite these potential clients over here. And I choose the potential clients. Now, what have I done there? I've done it because I think there's some possibility of repayment, as opposed to people that would seemingly be the better ones to choose because of the relationship to the person who ought to be being honored at that time, the bride. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here, is that what is your motive by whom you invited? Are you trying to do it for personal gain or to get better social status or something? And what better way for you to prove that that's not what you're doing by inviting the very people who can do nothing for you? So does it mean that we can't invite our friends? Kelvin?
Yes, and that's what I think it all boils down to, is why we're going to invite them. Because I don't think Jesus would condemn what they're doing here, inviting their friends. Because Jesus himself is taking place in this sociability and friendship gathering himself.
Right.
But he's there to teach a lesson. And even in this verse here, where they think at the end, when he said at the resurrection, we find that one of the Pharisees speak out and said that, yes, we'll be repaid in heaven. We'll have a dinner, in the kingdom of God. That's not it. What they're saying, what Jesus is saying, your repayment will be, after death in the kingdom. But anyway, I don't think Jesus would have a problem with us doing this, but like you said, I would think our motive would be the issue.
Yeah, and I think, Kelvin, that's exactly right. Jesus is going directly at the motive of what you are trying to do. Just like in the parable of the wedding feast, the person that tried to exalt themselves by going and plopping themselves down in the best seat, this person's trying to exalt themselves by who they invited and who they could get come to their party. Jesus is saying you can't think about it that way. We have just a few minutes. If we read verses 15 through 24, it's interesting because he's going to, someone else that heard what Jesus was saying says, well, let me give you the situation where everybody I invited, none of them wanted to come anyway. So what did Jesus say to do? Go out and invite those who probably needed the meal or something, and go out and do that. And he says, verse 23, and the master said to the servant, go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited shall taste my banquet, those that had refused the invitation. So as we sum up here, what he's talking about in these two parables, at least the way I interpret it, is the idea of humility. And he's using these very common examples of either you've been invited or you're the one throwing the party, how you are to think about it in terms of you're doing it. And the overriding theme in each of these is you are to put others above yourself. Does that seem to be a fair summary of this? Okay. Well, according to Jim's very precise clock, we have 57 seconds before we are to be done, which I'm glad to see the clock. Next week, we're going to look at chapter 14 and verse 25. It is, as you see, it is not a long reading. It's chapter 14, verse 25 through 33. But the challenge that it presents here, the cost of discipleship, I would suggest is a very broad topic. Joe?
I'd like to say something that you brought up very clearly on another occasion about humility.
Mm-hmm.
And what you had to say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you don't have to degrade yourself or degrade yourself in your own mind to lower yourself in such a way, in that kind of way, in order to be humble. The idea is that you can have what you have, and the other person can have what they have. You can think that you're trying to be on the right track and still think that the other person is quite, to be better than you in a lot of things.
Well, and Joe, that's a good point. If we go back to verse 7, and it says, now a parable to those who are invited. We don't know anything about the social standing or the wealth or the poverty of the people that were invited. It was, what is your attitude regardless of where you stand and how you're going to approach this situation?
Did I kind of get it right on what you said?
Yeah, mhm. Yeah. It's more about what is our attitude as opposed to where we're at. Because, Jesus is saying in verse 11, if you've tried to exalt yourself in whatever way you've done it, that's when you're going to be humbled. It doesn't mean that the individual who may have a lot wasn't still properly at the party. It's just like, what did he do? Did he come in and throw his weight around because, I'm so-and-so, and therefore I should be sitting here? I saw a hand. Oh, Antonella, and then you have the last word.
Okay. Pride is the opposite of humility, and that's one of the 7 deadly sins that God is against. And people tend to be proud, and it's not whether you're blind or crippled or color or whatever. God wants humility because we're humans, and we're to be humble because we need each other, and that's why we're here. We need Jesus.
Yeah, and you mentioned, we've been talking about humility. The antithesis of that is pride, which, we could look at verse after verse where pride is condemned and where the proud were frequently humbled, so that point would be driven home. Okay, so we'll pick up chapter 14, beginning in verse 25 next week.